Good day. Well, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have had their much anticipated meeting in Beijing on the first day of the Winter Olympics. This is the first occasion that the two leaders have been able to meet face to face in person for 2 years, ever since the pandemic began. So in that respect, this is an important meeting in itself between two leaders who have come to call each other and no doubt consider each other friends. And as Putin was careful to point out in a long interview he gave in advance of this meeting to the Chinese media, the two leaders are in fact in very regular contact. They frequently have telephone conversations and speak with each other. And of course, this is all interesting and important, but there is, as I think most people would agree, no actual substitute for one-to-one meetings. And I will just comment here about what Putin has to say about his contacts with Xi Jinping. President Xi Jinping and I have known each other for a long time as good friends and politicians who hold largely the same view on addressing the world's problems. We maintain close and frequent contact. That is why I immediately responded to his invitation to visit China and to join our Chinese friends in celebrating this year's main sporting event. Now, Putin says that they maintain frequent and regular contact. You wouldn't know that if you looked at the websites provided by the two governments, by the Russian and Chinese governments, because their websites scarcely ever mention regular and frequent meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping. You only hear about these meetings, these contacts that they frequently and regularly have when these meetings become public events like summit meetings or virtual summits or something of that nature. And it is a sign of how close and friendly these two leaders are and of the intimate and close way in which they liaise and discuss with each other that what is almost certainly the great bulk of the conversations that take place between the two of them are not disclosed and no readouts for them are published. So the very fact that, as I said, they conduct most of their discussions in what is in effect in secret shows the extent of their coordination and cooperation. But anyway, let's talk about this particular meeting. Now, there's been a massive flood of documents which have poured out of this meeting. There was that interview with the Chinese press, Putin's interview with the Chinese press, from which I've just quoted and which I just mentioned. There is a 6,000-word joint statement, which I'll come to shortly. There have been extensive readouts provided by both governments of all of these discussions, and there have also been extensive commentaries provided by the media of the two countries. If I was to cover every one of these documents, if I was to comment on every word that was written, what was said and what was exchanged in all of these documents, well, this video would not be one of my long videos of an hour plus. It would be my longest ever video of several hours plus. And actually, we don't need to do that because a lot of these documents actually cover what is already known ground. But I will highlight a number of important things. Let's first of all talk about the economic agreements. And the Russians have provided a helpful summary. And this is what we have learnt, the range of agreements. And here perhaps it's important to say the range of disclosed public agreements which the two leaders signed and agreed with each other during these meetings. And this is the Russian summary. The agreements include an intergovernmental agreement on cooperation in anti-monopoly legislation and competitive policy, and several other interdepartmental documents, such as the agreement on cooperation in ensuring compatibility and interoperability of GLONASS and Beidou navigation satellite systems in terms of the system timescales. GLONASS and Beidou are respectively the Russian and Chinese versions of American GPS. So they're going to be they're going to be integrated together, and that's perhaps unsurprising, but that I would have thought is a big deal. It'd be interesting to know, for example, whether their military aircraft can each from now on use the other system. I would have thought the short answer is almost certainly yes. Anyway, to continue. A joint statement on the completion of a roadmap for high-quality development of Russian-Chinese trade in goods and services. Well, that's a big phrase. I mean, presumably there's lots and lots of sub-clauses to this. We haven't seen it. A plan of consultations between the foreign ministries of Russia and China in 2022. Remember what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said some time ago about Team China-Russia? Well, the two foreign ministries now have a plan to coordinate and to work with each other. Plan of consultations. Wonder what that means precisely. By the way, in parenthesis, Lavrov was with Putin in Beijing over the course of this meeting, and he has also attended this meeting with Xi Jinping, and he's had a separate meeting with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Anyway, to continue. In addition to that, the two sides have signed a memorandum of understanding between the Russian Economic Development Ministry and the Chinese Ministry of Commerce to promote investment cooperation in sustainable green development. So Russia will be presumably able to participate in these technologies where the Chinese are known to be actually pretty advanced. Solar panels, batteries, all that sort of thing. And a joint statement between the relevant ministries on holding the Chinese and Russian years of cooperation in physical education and sports in 2022-2023. Well, no doubt that's all very interesting, but of course it's the economic deals that are perhaps the most eye-catching ones, because of course they chart the way these two countries are going. And then we went on to read the commercial contracts signed are related to the purchase and sale of natural gas via the Far Eastern route and the purchase and sale of crude oil for delivery to oil refineries in Western China. I'll come to that in a moment. Other documents signed include a memorandum of understanding on cooperation in the field of low-carbon development between Rosneft, that's the big Russian state-owned oil company, and China National Petroleum Corporation, and an agreement on cooperation in the information development and digitalization between Rosneft and Huawei Technologies for the period to 2027. What we've been learning recently on the issue of Huawei is that having been basically blocked from the United States and Western Europe, Huawei is now reorganizing and focusing on Russia. And it's apparently working with the Russians on developing its own operating system and its own app stores and things of that kind. And no doubt we will be seeing a new generation of Russian Chinese smartphones with produced largely by Huawei, and of course Huawei will be heavily involved in developing Russia's 5G networks. So an interesting range of economic and commercial agreements, one which just listed here, but ones which frankly, or in some ways, don't give us a huge amount of insight as to what exactly they mean. A roadmap for high quality development of Russian-Chinese trade in goods and services, for example. As I said, that seems to cover a vast possible range of subjects, and one would love to know more about what the details of that particular agreement are. But it is the gas and oil deal which has attracted international attention. And here we've had some more information provided to us courtesy of Reuters, who tell us under plans previously drawn up, Russia aims to resupply China with 38 billion cubic meters of gas by pipeline by 2025. And there's a new deal which the two have agreed. Gazprom has provided few details, so we are told, but the gas will come from the far eastern island of Sakhalin and will be transported via pipeline across the Japan Sea to northeast China's Heilongjiang province, reaching up to 10 billion cubic meters a year around 2026, said a Beijing source. And the deal would be settled in euros, in line with the efforts by the two states to diversify away from US dollars. And in fact, there are already, this is the third pipeline deal for natural gas agreed by the Chinese and the Russians. The first pipeline deal, Power of Siberia 1, is already in operation. It provides China with natural gas on a huge scale from Russia's natural gas fields, and it is now in full operation and is apparently functioning very well. And of course, last year there was an agreement to build another pipeline, Power of Siberia 2, which will be substantially bigger than Power of Siberia 1 and which will provide even more gas than Power of Siberia 1, but this time from the West Siberian fields, Russia's West Siberian natural gas fields, which incidentally and in passing are the same fields from which Russia supplies most of the gas it sends to Europe. So this has apparently caused some tremors in Europe. There's concerns that eventually the Russians will start to divert more and more of the gas in these West Siberian fields to China and will send less of it to Western Europe. Anyway, this third pipeline deal, which is by a significant margin, by the way, the smallest, and seems to be more a regional project, is going to send natural gas from Russia's Far East island of Sakhalin. This is a Pacific island, to China's Heilongjiang province. And it's going to be by a very considerable margin the smallest of these three pipelines. There may be more pipelines, of course, in process of development. I would add that Power of Siberia 2, when it is completed, will give the Russians the option of switching gas deliveries from Europe to Asia, because as it will connect with the same pipeline that provides gas to Europe, if Russia finds difficulties sending gas to Europe, it can then switch it to Asia, to China, and of course, in theory, vice versa. And for example, if there is a particular cold snap in China, but the weather in Europe is warm, as is, by the way, the case at the moment, then of course the Russians could shift gas round via these various pipelines, making sure that the gas from West Siberia, more of it goes to China where it's more needed, less of it goes to Europe where it's less needed, and of course vice versa, depending on market conditions. So building these pipelines not only strengthens Russia's position as the major gas supplier to China, but of course it does actually allow potentially more flexibility in Russia's pipeline gas sales. And of course it's important to say that all of these pipeline gas projects are supplemented by the enormous liquefied natural gas projects that Russia is operating in the far north, in the Arctic, which have also received very substantial Chinese funding. So big deals on gas. And on the topic of the fact that the Chinese will be paying the Russians for all of this gas in euros, I think this might actually require some clarification, some explanation. Russia sells natural gas to Europe, and of course it gets paid for that gas in euros. Russia will be selling its natural gas to China, and of course it will be paid for that gas in euros as well. So Russia's natural gas trade is going to be almost entirely in euros, and I suspect that's not going to change. There's no reason why it should in the short term, but in the medium to long term, obviously the Chinese and the Russians will want to move this trade between China and Russia away from euros onto their national currencies. So at some point, the Chinese will want to start paying for this gas they import from Russia in RMB, Chinese currency, and the Russians will want at that point to be able to either hold that Chinese currency in their state bank reserves or potentially convert it into rubles. So, this is a transitional stage of using the euro in the Chinese-Russian gas trade. However, coming back to this topic of the use of the euro, I think it is a little understood fact that Russia's trade in natural gas is already almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely, already conducted in euros. Some Russian natural gas, liquefied natural gas, is sold in international markets. It is paid for in dollars, but there's no reason why customers can't pay for that natural gas in euros too. And given that Russia is by far the dominant supplier of natural gas in the world, it seems to me that the reality is that the dollar is being marginalized in the international gas trade, and that the international gas trade, the trade in natural gas, is increasingly going to be conducted in euros as opposed to dollars. So when the United States talks about sanctioning Russian banks, the big Russian state banks, to prevent them converting dollars into rubles, it's important to say that already Russia, in terms of its natural gas trade, it doesn't actually receive many dollars in return for its gas. That trade is already largely conducted in euros. The oil business, Russia's oil business, is different. The currency in which oil is traded internationally is the dollar, the US dollar, and countries that buy oil from Russia pay for their oil in dollars, at least for the time being. But if the sanctions that the United States has been talking about are imposed, high probability is that much of that trade will convert to euros too. So again, it's important to clarify all of this. These sanctions that have been talked about barring Russian gas, or rather Russian banks, from using dollars, they're not going to be quite as effective or as important as some people in the United States apparently believe. And by the way, I'm fairly sure that in the interim, even if the Russians have some difficulties selling oil for euros, they will eventually find customers. And in the meantime, they would still probably be able to find people who are prepared to pay them in dollars for their oil. And there would, of course, still be mechanisms for the Russians to convert those dollars into rubles if they needed to. After all, Iran has done it. Why shouldn't Russia be able to do it too? So these sanctions are not a good idea if they're ever implemented, and we can see the direction that events are taking. Anyway, that's enough about this particular energy deal. I hope you've all got some idea of the extent to which economic cooperation between these two countries is now unfolding. And it's perhaps worth saying that the direction of travel is for Russia increasingly to reduce its sales of natural gas to Europe, which will cause major problems there, increase its sales of natural gas to China, and of course, because of the concern that the Russians undoubtedly have that this will commit them to one customer, we can see that the Chinese are reciprocating by entering into all sorts of detailed economic agreements with the Russians, which will mean that the trade between the two countries is balanced, so that the Chinese are not in a position to dictate conditions to the Russians, because the gas and oil trade will be conducted within a vast nexus of other trade systems. Just to repeat again, the comments that the Russians have made, the commercial contracts signed are related to the purchase and sale of natural gas. So this gas trade between China and Russia is the driver behind what is in effect a process of its integration of the two economies. And what does each get from this? Well, China gets strategic depth. It's having increasing difficulties with the United States. They're becoming increasingly exacerbated. They have to worry, the Chinese have to worry that at some point relations between the United States could completely break down, and the United States might try and use its much more powerful navy and its control of world trade routes to try to choke China off from imports of vital raw materials, of food, of energy, of other commodities, of important metals, of mineral products, or whatever. Russia is able to provide all of those, and of course much of this will come via pipelines, overland pipelines, and of course via sea routes, which are not easily interfered with by the US Navy, because they can be protected by the Russian and Chinese fleets as they will move along Russian and Chinese coastlines. And note that these joint Navy patrols that the Russians and the Chinese have recently been undertaking seem to be focused along the far eastern routes, along the Pacific routes, that much of this Russian-Chinese trade would follow, in the event, especially in the event of a crisis between China and the United States. So it does seem as if the Chinese and Russian navies, one of the things that they're doing is rehearsing and preparing for the day when they might have to be used in order to prevent interdiction of their maritime trade, the maritime trade they conduct with each other in the event of a crisis with the United States and attempts by the United States to interfere through its navy with that maritime trade. So keep all that in mind. It's important background. What do the Russians get? Well, the Russians actually have a fairly large and sophisticated economy. There was actually a very recent and helpful article in The Economist which pointed out that if you take the Big Mac comparison, if you compare how much a Big Mac costs in every country in the world and try and work it out and try to use that as a basis for working out the cost structure in each economy, if you do that, then the ruble is the most undervalued of the major currencies. It is more undervalued than the Turkish lira, for example, which is a remarkable fact. And if you were to take the ruble's real value, what its real notional value might be on the Big Mac standard, then it is trading at less than a third of its real value. That's a pretty remarkable fact. Just consider, we're talking about a country, Russia, with the world's largest territory, self-sufficient in oil and energy, self-sufficient in food, with a pretty sophisticated industrial and a very sophisticated high technology base. It has a current account surplus. It has very low debt. And of course, its budget is in surplus. In fact, it's currently running a surplus on its budget of 7% of its nominal GDP. So it's very remarkable, actually, when you think about it, that the Russian currency is so grotesquely undervalued. And of course, that is a reflection of the geopolitical tensions, of Russia's ridiculously low credit rating, and of the fact that the country is under sanctions. But if you follow the Big Mac approach and recalculate the size of the Russian economy, factoring out all of these problems that keep the ruble so depreciated, you would find on that kind of basis that the Russian economy is at least 3 times bigger than its nominal GDP might lead you to think. So Russia has a pretty big, fairly diversified GDP. It's got a significant industrial base, a significant manufacturing base, a very advanced high technology base. It's got its own financial system, and it's self-sufficient, as I said, in food and energy. But obviously, from a Russian point of view, being connected to what is rapidly becoming the world's biggest market and the world's biggest source of capital, which is China, and recent figures provided by the World Bank show that China is now today the world's biggest lender, having some time ago overtaken the United States. Being so intimately connected with this huge economy can only be good for Russia. And coming back to that earlier point about Russia's ridiculously low credit rating, which makes absolutely no sense, calculated on the basis of Russia's fundamentals. There's no doubt that low credit rating has affected Russian economic growth because it's deterred Western institutional investors, depriving Russia of the kind of foreign investment it might have otherwise received if its credit rating had been more objective. But of course, that's not going to deter Chinese institutional investors especially given the fact that China has now developed its own credit rating systems. So it makes good economic sense for Russia too. And of course, it makes good economic sense in terms of Russia's current standoff with the West. Because, of course, the United States is now talking about blockading Russia from various high-end technologies which supposedly are vital for the development of the Russian economy. I really need to repeat again a point I have made many times. The United States seriously underestimates Russia's technological base. I think they imagine that the country is still far more behind in its technological proficiencies than it actually is. But the fact is that with China, with this trade with China, the United States will find that the Russians and the Chinese integrating their technologies in the way that they are, that's not going to be the problem for the Russians that they imagine it will, because any technologies that the Russians can't develop themselves, they can import from the Chinese. And as the Huawei-Rosneft deal shows, they're already anyway working with the Chinese on joint projects together. Note, by the way, that Huawei is already a sanctioned company. So threats of American sanctions against it to prevent it working with the Russians, for example, in smartphone and microchip technologies, that's not going to deter Huawei at all, because of course it's already there, it's already been sanctioned. And that brings me back to some of the political statements. There's been this enormous joint statement that the Russians and the Chinese have now published. Now, again, I don't think this needs detailed analysis. As I said, it's a 6,000 word statement. If I were to go through it all, I would be spending, as I said, several hours analysing and discussing every single point on it. But it's important to say that it's, in some respects, a philosophical statement, in the sense that it shows the ideological convergence. I use the word ideological very precisely, the ideological convergence of the two countries. Though China is a communist state, avowedly communist state, whereas Russia no longer is, the statement goes out of its way to make clear that the overall perspectives and outlooks of the two countries are very similar. So, for example, in Article 1, the Chinese and the Russians make clear that they do not accept Western ideas about how democracy should function or how human rights and human rights policies should operate, and that they are very strongly opposed to the way in which they see the United States and its allies, its Western allies, trying to weaponize those concepts and to use them in order to impose its own ideas upon other countries. Then in section 2, they talk about the integration of their two economies, the integration of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and the Eurasian Economic Union. And they talk now openly about a greater Eurasian partnership. In other words, essentially, the integration of Eurasia. I have always said this, and I'm going to say this again, to a very great extent, not entirely. The Belt and Road Initiative is something which is focused on this cooperation with Russia and the Central Asian states more than it is on anything else. And I think this is not widely understood, but that is the key focus of Chinese economic policy making. There's also much talk in Section 2 about developing green technologies together, working together on scientific and technological developments, acting to enhance economic growth developing green technologies, developing pharmaceutical products, etc. Then there is Article 3, is perhaps the most topical one. It's about the international relations. It goes out of its way to say that the Chinese and the Russians have similar perspectives on international relations. And we read, the Russian side reaffirms its support for the One China principle, confirms that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and opposes any forms of independence of Taiwan. That, of course, is the key issue for the Chinese. And in return, the statement goes on to say that the sides believe that certain states, that military and political alliances and coalitions seek to obtain directly or indirectly unilateral military advantages to the detriment of the security of others. The sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches to respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilizational, cultural, and historical backgrounds, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful development of states. So the Russians support China over Taiwan, the Chinese support Russia over NATO enlargement, and by implication, the Ukraine crisis as well. And it goes on because we also learn that the Russians back the China over AUKUS, this new arrangement between the United States, Australia, and Britain. The sides are seriously concerned about the trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, AUKUS, which provides for deeper cooperation between its members in areas involving strategic stability, in particular their decision to initiate cooperation in the field of nuclear-powered submarines. Russia and China believe that such actions are contrary to the objectives of security and sustainable development in the Asia-Pacific region, increase the danger of an arms race in the region, and pose serious risks of nuclear proliferation. The sides strongly condemn such moves and call on AUKUS participants to fulfill their nuclear and missile non-proliferation commitments in good faith and to work together to safeguard peace, stability, and development in the region. So Russia joins China in criticizing and opposing AUKUS. How long, I wonder, before the Chinese start covertly or perhaps openly receiving help from the Russians in developing their own nuclear submarine fleet in rivalry to those of the Western powers. Nuclear submarines is one technology where the Chinese are well behind the Russians by all accounts. So quite possibly, some point in the next couple of years, we could start to see Chinese submarines becoming much quieter, far more powerful, after getting help or insight or design tips from the Russians. And perhaps, not impossibly, before long, we could even see the Chinese fielding in the Pacific submarines, nuclear submarines, similar to, perhaps even identical to, the Russian Yasen-M submarines, which by most estimates are the most advanced nuclear-powered submarines, at least most advanced attack fleet submarines in the world. So that would be an interesting development, but anyway, the two sides are agreed about that. They're also agreed, by the way, on things like the INF Treaty. They criticize the United States for pulling out of it. They call on the United States to enter into negotiations. And then we read that the Chinese side is sympathetic to and supports the proposals put forward by the Russian Federation to create long-term, legally binding security guarantees in Europe. Russians, Chinese, straightforwardly support the Russians on this. And they also support each other, the Russians and the Chinese support each other on the weaponization of outer space. And clearly they're going to be working closely on outer space related matters. In fact, they already have a project to set up a joint lunar base. So much going on that front. And, lots of things on those sort of things, on these sort of matters, on chemical weapons as well, on every conceivable field of security and weapon systems and the rest. And then there's a further Article 4 discusses the issue of what is the international community and the fact that they reject what they see as US and Western exceptionalism and such things, and that they continue to see the United Nations as the key institution. And they also talk about the various organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that they have created together. So this is a joint statement which covers a lot of ground. It covers a lot of ground that they have already touched on in previous statements, but again it amplifies the extent to which the Chinese and the Russians are now working together on all sorts of matters. They're coordinating, they're operating their two countries, they're working together as a team, they're increasingly integrating their economies, they're developing their foreign policies in harness, they're developing their security policies in harness as well. And then we've had an immensely long, always these immensely long readouts from the Chinese about the nature of readouts of the talks between Xi Jinping and Putin. And again, I'm not going to read out this whole readout. It would take forever. It's much longer than the shorter Russian readout. But there are some interesting paragraphs, like this one. President Xi underscored that in response to an international landscape full of profound and complex evolution, China and Russia have stayed committed to deepening strategic cooperation, of mutual support, and standing shoulder to shoulder for international fairness and justice. This is a strategic choice that will have a far-reaching impact on China, Russia, and the rest of the world. The two countries have never and will never waver in this choice. The two sides need to keep up their close, high-level exchanges, follow their four-point agreement on firm, mutual support, strongly support each other in upholding sovereignty, security, and development interests, effectively counter external interference and threats to regional stability, and maintain international strategic stability. The two sides need to engage in even closer coordination and collaboration in international affairs and demonstrate responsibility and take action as two major countries to address issues of immediate concern to the international community, including combating the pandemic, bolstering growth, and tackling climate change. So a somewhat purple paragraph all about how they're going to stand shoulder to shoulder, have each other's backs, work together, coordinate ever more closely, and then, of course, in typical Chinese style, as you're expecting, some powerful statements about the United States. The Chinese are always careful at the last moment to dial it down and to make it seem as if this is all about combating the pandemic, bolstering growth, and tackling climate change. Well, of course, it isn't. It's all about these the strategic cooperation between these two very powerful countries. And helpfully, the Chinese have also provided us with a detailed commentary in Where Else Global Times. And it's perhaps fair to say that one doesn't need to pass all these enormous documents. One can simply go to this article in Global Times and one discovers that it covers pretty much everything. And we read as follows. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday afternoon, stressing the further deepening of back-to-back strategic coordination in upholding international fairness and justice and adhering to the four consensuses on supporting each other's sovereignty, security and development interests to better tackle external interference and regional threats as they exchange views on a series of major issues regarding global strategy, strategic security and stability. And then there's a discussion about there's a detailed reference in the article to the joint statement. And then we read in this article, China and Russia share the understanding that democracy is a universal human value rather than a privilege of a limited number of countries. So it's not something for the United States to claim that it owns and to try to impose it on everyone else. This is a universal human value, and each country is entitled to follow its own approach and interpretation towards achieving it. Well, that's the Chinese line at the moment, and the Russians have adopted it. And then the article goes on to say that Russia has reaffirmed its support for the One China principle, reiterating that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and that it opposes any form of Taiwan independence. And then we read, China and Russia also oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the bloc to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches. And the two countries also share serious concerns over AUKUS. And then we read about all the major documents of cooperation, various areas that they signed, underscoring the unprecedented strategic partnership between Russia and China, which is not only in the interests of the two countries, but also the stability of the world. And then we read that the China-Russia bilateral partnership is unprecedented and an example of a dignified relationship. Deepened strategic cooperation between Russia and China will also help the two countries. And then there's references to the meeting between Wang Yi and Lavrov, and how the two of them how the two countries are working to uphold peace and stability within the Asia-Pacific region. Well, I've skimmed through the documents very quickly because, as I said, it would take hours to go over all of them. But here I'm going to make a general observation. This crisis that we now have in Europe over Ukraine, over NATO's eastward enlargement, this brewing crisis that we have over Taiwan, all of these are the product of this growth in this alliance or de facto alliance or strategic partnership or better than alliance, at any rate, this partnership between China and Russia, these two great nuclear powers, these huge potential powers that we are now seeing. The fact that the Russians have the Chinese at their backs is what is enabling the Russians to start making demands that NATO's eastward expansion be stopped. The fact that the Russians will be supplying China with all the natural resources that it needs, the food, the energy, the strategic minerals and all of that, and will be able to do so without interference from the US fleet, that is going to start giving the Chinese the confidence to take stronger positions with respect to Taiwan and the issues around the South and East China Seas, and to confront the United States over them. And of course, all of this is taking place at the same time as we see the steadily cranking up rhythm of integration across Eurasia, the Greater Eurasian Partnership referred to in the joint statement, the building of road links, railway links, pipelines, ports, the development of the Northern Sea route, all of these things, all of them happening together, tying up the Eurasian landmass, ultimately industrializing it, integrating it into a single economic bloc and economic system. The last time anything on this scale happened was in the late 19th century with the industrialization within the United States of the North American continent. Something of a similar scale is now taking place in Eurasia today. Similar scale, I say, because the industrialization of the North American continent changed completely the dynamics of the geopolitical dynamics of the 20th century world. And this industrialization of Eurasia, this integration and industrialization of Eurasia, which is also taking place, could have a similar impact on the evolution, the geopolitical evolution of the 21st century. This idea that some people still have, that the Chinese and the Russians can be talked out of this relationship, that the United States can somehow put pressure on Russia, or can try to get China to put pressure on Russia to tone down its positions in Ukraine or in the over NATO enlargement. All of that shows a fundamental failure to understand the scale of the processes that are going on. And to talk further of sanctions, as these sanctions have any real relevance in the face of this process, is also, I think, to misunderstand again what exactly is happening. Now, all of this, as I said, is taking place. I don't think it's reversible. I think that in an important respect, the train has now left the station. I think that China is obviously fully committed to this process. There are still a few people in Russia who are opposed to it, but they are becoming marginalized. And the more Russian businesses, the more Russian industries, technologies are tied up into this system, the more unlikely it becomes that Russia will ever want to break from it. So I personally think that the train here has already left the station. But if this is going to change, if this process of integration, together with, by the way, the economic upswing in the Far East, if all of this is going to change the world's geopolitical picture, it doesn't mean that this has to be threatening. It doesn't mean that it has to be dangerous to the United States or to Western Europe or to anyone else. It will only become dangerous, or so it seems to me, if there is some external project to impede it, to prevent it from happening, or if the Western powers persist in this policy of confrontation with these two powerful countries, China and Russia, and fail to recognize that these two countries now have interests which they are determined to protect, and that in doing so, each has the support of the other. Now, if the Western powers continue in their current policy of resisting the Chinese and the Russians in this respect, if they continue to try to hold the line, even on issues like, say, the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, which are, or the situation in the South China Sea, which are only peripheral to themselves, then of course they will ensure that this colossal development of Eurasian integration will indeed become hostile to themselves. And that, can I say, would be both extremely dangerous and a tragedy. It is eminently avoidable. Diplomatic action, political engagement, commercial and economic engagement can prevent it. In fact, played properly, there is no reason why the United States and other Western countries could not benefit economically by participating in this process of economic integration in Eurasia, by, say, investing in it, by putting their own money in it. After all, that's what the British did in the late 19th century. Their relations with the United States at that time were often far from good, and yet British investors invested heavily at that time in the development of the US economy. They played a major role, for example, in financing the building of the railroads in the United States. And J.P. Morgan, the famous banker, one of the reasons he was able to fund so much of the programs for the industrialization of the United States was because he was very close to the various powerful British financial institutions and was able to arrange for funding from them to flow into the United States. And I think it's fair to say that this ultimately benefited both the Americans and the British. And after the political differences between the two, which were very real in the 19th century, were overcome, it consolidated the friendship that eventually developed between these two nations. And it seems to me that if the West were to play its cards correctly, it could potentially achieve the same thing. I think that is the best policy by far to follow, because, as I said, the alternative is that this process of Eurasian integration will take place, but instead of being friendly to ourselves, or at least perhaps not exactly friendly, but open to ourselves, it could turn out to be dangerous to ourselves. And then the danger for me is not that we will become overwhelmed or conquered by the Chinese and the Russians, by the Eurasians, by the various other Eurasian states that start, Asian and no doubt states of the global south that start to rearrange themselves around this new system. The danger rather is that we will become marginalized, that in Europe at least we could find ourselves an economic and cultural backwater, which would be a very difficult thing, I suspect, for most Europeans to come to terms with. Anyway, that's the choice we face. It is, I have to say, always, and I find these developments between the Chinese and the Russians impressive for their scale and ambition, and it is for me refreshing sometimes to see things on this scale being worked out by these two countries with each other. It makes so much of what goes on in the West, Partygate in Britain, for example, the absurdities of the Russiagate affair in the United States, all of that, it makes it look so, dare I say, provincial and petty compared to these great developments that are taking place between China and Russia and across Eurasia. But I think we need to learn from them, and we need to have perspective. And I worry, frankly, that that's precisely what we don't have. Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm almost up to my hour, so I'm not going to say any more. Just to remind you again to join us on Locals and to participate in our community there, and to check out our shop and to look us up on our other platforms, of which you will find many other links under this video. Thank you again.